On a silent luxury flight where every detail whispered privilege, a black CEO settled confidently into his reserved VIP seat, unaware that a storm of injustice was about to unfold before countless watching eyes, when suddenly a flight attendant approached with cold authority, demanding that he vacate his rightful place, not for safety, not for error, but simply to make room for a white passenger who had arrived moments late. A demand that dripped with arrogance and centuries of untold prejudice, leaving the CEO frozen for a split second between shock and rage, as whispers spread among passengers, some too afraid to intervene, others recording the humiliating scene, and while his dignity was being stripped in plain sight, no one knew that behind his calm silence burned a fire of revenge. Because this was not just any passenger, this was the man who held the ultimate power, and what seemed like a moment of defeat was about to become a shocking twist that no one on that flight would ever forget. The CEO looked up in disbelief, his ticket clutched firmly in his hand as he asked the staff why he should leave the seat he had rightfully paid for. But his question was met with silence, their eyes cold and dismissive as if his presence in that space was an error that needed correction. And when he calmly showed them proof, they brushed it aside with arrogance, repeating their demand that he stand up immediately, insisting that another passenger, a white man, deserved that seat more than he did, a moment that dripped with raw injustice and unspoken prejudice. And as the scene unfolded, the entire cabin grew tense, some passengers whispering nervously, others quietly recording, but none brave enough to speak in his defense. And though the CEO's face remained controlled, his mind burned with the sting of humiliation. Yet hidden beneath that calm exterior lay a power that no one in that room could even begin to imagine. With his voice ignored and his dignity challenged, the CEO rose slowly from his seat, not with the weakness they expected, but with a calmness that carried the weight of years of discipline and restraint, though inside his chest burned a storm of rage that he refused to show. The staff, smirking with quiet satisfaction, guided him away as though removing a child from a place he did not belong, their arrogant expressions revealing that this was not about rules or mistakes, but about power, about sending a cruel message that his skin made him unworthy of the comfort he had rightfully earned. As the aisle cleared, the white passenger walked forward with an air of entitlement, sliding into the plush leather seat as if the humiliation of another man was simply his privilege to enjoy, crossing his legs casually and adjusting his jacket. Completely indifferent to the injustice that had just played out before a silent crowd, the cabin buzzed with uneasy whispers, some passengers bowing their heads in shame, others turning their cameras discreetly toward the scene, knowing they were witnessing something larger than a seat dispute, something that carried the ugly shadow of history. The attendants exchanged subtle glances of triumph, convinced that they had asserted control, blind to the fact that the man they had insulted was far more powerful than they could ever imagine. Every movement of the CEO appeared composed, but behind his silence was a carefully concealed fire, a voice that screamed inside him not to act in anger but to let the right moment arrive. Because revenge taken in haste fades quickly, but revenge delivered with precision becomes unforgettable. As he stood there, his hands loosely folded, he seemed to accept the humiliation. Yet his eyes told another story, a story of patience, strategy, and a devastating twist waiting to unfold. The passengers, unaware of his true identity, looked at him as just another man forced down by an unjust system. But the reality was far more extraordinary, because hidden behind his quiet suffering was the authority to rewrite the fate of everyone on board. The staff, too caught up in their false victory, failed to notice the subtle tightening of his jaw, the controlled breath he drew as though he was swallowing fire. And in that silence lay a suspense that hung heavy in the air, a storm waiting for the moment to strike. Each second of forced humiliation was being carved into memory, not as defeat, but as fuel for what was coming. And though the attendants believed they had silenced him, the truth was that their arrogance had already written their downfall. For this man was not simply a passenger, he was the very hand that signed their future, and soon the same cabin where they smirked would echo with the sound of justice delivered in its most shocking and unforgettable form. The CEO remained standing in the aisle for a brief moment, his posture calm, his expression unreadable, and while the staff believed they had broken him, they failed to see the quiet storm forming behind his steady gaze. Without raising his voice, without showing even a trace of open defiance, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his sleek phone, the device sliding into his hand like a weapon hidden in plain sight. The attendants dismissed the gesture, assuming he was calling a friend or perhaps venting to someone who could do nothing, but his fingers moved with deliberate precision. Each tap purposeful, each second measured. His lips did not tremble, his voice did not crack. Instead, he spoke with a tone so calm it was chilling, as if he were discussing a simple business detail, not the humiliation he had just endured. Passengers tried to eavesdrop, their ears straining to catch words, but the low, measured tone carried only fragments, enough to spark curiosity, enough to whisper of something greater. He did not plead, he did not complain, he did not even mention what had just happened, and that silence carried a power far more dangerous than any angry outburst could. His eyes, sharp and unwavering, scanned the cabin briefly, landing on the staff who now moved with casual arrogance. One pouring champagne for the man in his stolen seat, another laughing quietly, as though the matter was closed, but his eyes held a promise, an unspoken declaration that what they thought was victory was nothing more than the beginning of their fall. Every passenger who looked at him felt a shiver, though they could not explain why, because his gaze was not of a man defeated, but of a predator, waiting in stillness for the perfect strike. He ended the call with a quiet confirmation, slipped the phone back into his pocket, and returned to his temporary seat with a composure so controlled it unsettled those who dared watch him. There was no protest, no scene, no desperate attempt to reclaim dignity, just silence wrapped in suspense, the kind of silence that lingers longer than thunder. The air inside the cabin grew heavy, though no one could explain why, as if an invisible clock had begun ticking towards something inevitable. The staff dismissed him as powerless, yet their ignorance blinded them from the reality that they were now trapped inside a story where the ending would not be written by them. His stillness became the loudest statement in the room, a suspense that stretched across every row, a tension that told the audience of fate that revenge was no longer a possibility but a certainty. And when it arrived, it would not whisper, it would roar, shaking every witness into silence and rewriting the meaning of power in one unforgettable stroke. Minutes passed in tense silence, the CEO sitting with his hands folded, his expression unreadable, while the staff carried on as if nothing had happened, their laughter sharp, their arrogance unshaken. But then, from the cockpit, the captain's radio crackled with urgency, a direct message from the airline's head office, and the calm routine of the flight suddenly shifted into something far more serious. The captain, confused, picked up the line, expecting routine instructions, but what he heard left him stunned. The voice on the other end was firm, authoritative, and absolute, ordering him to put the call on speaker immediately. Within seconds, the cabin crew was summoned to the front, their smirks fading as they noticed the unusual gravity in the captain's face. The passengers leaned forward, sensing that something unexpected was unfolding, though none of them could predict the storm about to strike. The voice from the head office cut through the air like a blade, announcing that the man they had just humiliated was not an ordinary traveler, not a powerless victim, but the very CEO of the airline itself, the highest authority in the skies they flew. Shock rippled through the cabin, disbelief painted on every face, as the attendants froze where they stood, their arrogance draining instantly into dread. The white passenger who had taken the seat shifted uncomfortably, suddenly realizing that he was part of a scene that would not end well, his earlier confidence replaced by silent panic. The CEO did not move, did not gloat. He simply sat there in quiet power, allowing the truth to land like a thunderclap across every soul on board. The captain, still processing the revelation, turned toward him with newfound respect, his voice trembling slightly as he addressed him, not as a passenger, but as the ultimate authority, a man whose signature determined their very careers. The staff who had dismissed him now struggled to meet his gaze, their faces pale, their breaths shallow, as the crushing weight of their mistake settled in. The passengers who had whispered earlier now gasped aloud, phones raised higher, eager to capture the unfolding twist that no one could have scripted better. The man they had thought powerless, the man they had humiliated in front of everyone, was in fact the owner of everything around them, the one person no one could afford to cross. The silence that followed was unbearable, every heartbeat loud in the charged atmosphere, as eyes darted between the CEO and the trembling crew. Still, he remained calm, letting the revelation sink deeper, letting their fear grow heavier, until the truth itself became punishment enough. Revenge was no longer a hidden thought. It was now a living reality, and in that moment every person on that flight realized that the greatest power does not shout. It waits, it watches, and when it finally speaks, the world has no choice but to listen. The silence that followed the revelation was thick enough to crush the arrogance out of every smirk that once filled the cabin. And for a moment the attendants stood frozen, caught between disbelief and terror, while the passengers leaned forward, their eyes wide with anticipation, waiting for the man they had underestimated to finally rise. Slowly, with measured grace, the CEO stood from his temporary seat, his tall frame commanding the attention of every single soul on board. And as he stepped into the aisle, the entire plane seemed to hold its breath. His footsteps were not hurried, they were deliberate, each one echoing with the authority of a man who no longer needed to prove himself because the truth had already spoken louder than any argument could. He stopped near the center of the cabin, turned to face the staff, and in a voice that was calm yet sharp enough to cut through the air, he delivered the words that would forever be remembered. "I am the CEO of this airline," he declared, his eyes locking onto the very attendants who had stripped him of dignity only moments before. "And you're all fired." The sentence hung in the air like a thunderclap, and instantly the cabin erupted with gasps, whispers, and the sound of phones capturing every second of the historic moment. The staff's faces drained of color, their proud smiles collapsing into wide-eyed panic, as the weight of his words settled over them like an unshakable shadow. The white passenger who had taken his seat shifted uneasily, his earlier entitlement dissolving into shame, realizing that the humiliation he had been complicit in had now turned into a spectacle of justice. Some passengers clapped nervously, others exchanged shocked glances, but all of them felt the same electric thrill of watching arrogance burn to ash in the face of true power. The CEO did not shout, he did not raise his voice, but the calm finality in his tone carried more force than any scream could, and the trembling staff knew there was no escape from the consequences they had brought upon themselves. One of the attendants stammered, trying to beg for mercy, but the words fell flat in the heavy silence, their pleas sounding weak and meaningless against the sharp memory of the humiliation they had so proudly delivered only minutes earlier. The CEO's eyes did not soften, his expression did not bend, because this was no longer about anger, it was about justice, about reminding the world that dignity cannot be taken without consequence. The cameras kept rolling, the passengers kept watching, and the cabin itself seemed to transform into a courtroom, with the man they had scorned now standing as judge, jury, and executioner. His declaration was not just a punishment. It was a lesson carved into the air. Respect is not optional, justice is not negotiable, and power does not need to shout to be heard. It only needs the right moment to speak, and when it does, no one can look away. The moment his words echoed through the cabin, the very staff who only minutes earlier had worn pride on their faces now collapsed under the crushing weight of reality, their arrogance evaporating into sheer desperation as they stumbled forward, hands clasped together, begging for mercy in trembling voices that shook with fear. One attendant's eyes filled with tears as she pleaded that it had been a misunderstanding. Another muttered apologies so quickly they tripped over their own words, but their excuses fell flat. Because everyone in the cabin had witnessed the truth, and no apology could erase the sting of humiliation they had so confidently inflicted. Their polished uniforms, once symbols of authority, now seemed like costumes masking weakness, and the more they begged, the clearer it became that the power they thought they held had never belonged to them at all. The white passenger sat frozen in the stolen seat, his face pale, his body stiff, as if the weight of shame had pinned him down. And though he opened his mouth once to speak, no words came out. Because how could he defend the indefensible? How could he justify sitting in comfort while another man's dignity was stripped away in front of dozens of eyes? He shifted uncomfortably, wishing he could vanish, but the cameras were already on him, recording his silence as loudly as any spoken word. The passengers, who had until then remained observers, now became witnesses to justice in its purest form, watching the balance of power tilt dramatically before their eyes. The CEO stood tall, unmoved by the desperate cries of those who had once laughed at his expense, his calm demeanor unshaken as he reminded them that every action carries consequences, and theirs had arrived sooner than they ever expected. The attendants clutched at the air as though they could pull their dignity back with their hands, but nothing could undo the damage. Nothing could erase the memory of their cruel smiles when they believed themselves untouchable. The sound of gasps, whispers, and phones recording grew louder, every passenger knowing they would remember this moment long after the flight ended, because they had seen arrogance punished and injustice shattered in real time. The staff, now visibly trembling, fell silent one by one, realizing that their pleas were useless, that the man before them would not bend to crocodile tears, because he had not risen to his position by being fooled by theatrics. His gaze remained steady, his silence heavier than any scolding, and it became clear to all that mercy was not the lesson today. Justice was the only answer, and it was being delivered on the very stage where humiliation had once played out. In that cabin, under the unblinking eyes of every witness, the balance of power had been restored, and the staff who once believed they had won now stood broken, exposed, and forever marked by the very arrogance that led to their downfall. With the staff silenced and the truth standing tall in the cabin, The CEO turned with measured grace and walked back to the seat that had always been his, every step echoing like a reminder that dignity can be stolen for a moment, but never taken forever. As he sat down, reclaiming his rightful place, the tension inside the aircraft shattered into thunderous applause. Passengers rising with claps and cheers that carried both relief and admiration, their voices filling the cabin with the sound of justice finally delivered. The white passenger sat in stunned silence, his earlier entitlement now nothing but a heavy shadow of shame, while the attendants stood defeated, knowing they had written the end of their own careers. The cameras kept rolling, capturing the most unforgettable twist of all. The man who was humiliated had turned humiliation into triumph, and his story closed with a timeless truth. Respect is not given by color, it is earned by character.